September 12th, 1943, 27,000 feet above the North Sea. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth crouched in the tail turret of the B-17 Tondelayo, his gloved hands gripping twin 50-caliber Browning machine guns that had already fired more rounds than he could count. Through the scratched plexiglas, he watched a Messerschmitt 109 knife through the defensive formation, black crosses stark against winter-pale aluminum. Every instinct in his body screamed to put his gunsight directly on that enemy fighter. Point at the threat, pull the trigger, watch it explode. That was what made sense. That was what felt natural. That was what every fibre of his being demanded. Instead, Arooth did something that seemed completely insane. He aimed 8 aircraft lengths behind the Messerschmitt, between the German fighter and his own bomber's tail. He aimed at empty sky where the enemy had already been, trusting mathematics he barely understood, and training that violated every hunting instinct bred into human beings over millions of years. The Brownings roared. Tracers arced through the freezing air. 2 seconds later, the Messerschmitt disintegrated in a ball of orange flame. It was Arooth's 3rd kill of the mission. Before the day ended, he would shoot down 7 German fighters, earning him the Distinguished Service Cross. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today, and a place in aviation history. But more importantly, his success that day represented the culmination of a desperate 2-year struggle to solve a problem that was killing American bomber crews at an unsustainable rate. The problem was simple, brutal, and counterintuitive. When firing from a moving bomber at an attacking fighter, aiming directly at the target guaranteed a miss. The secret to survival was learning to aim where the target had already been. This technique, called position firing, would transform American aerial gunners from frightened men spraying bullets uselessly into the sky into precision marksmen, capable of bringing down enemy aircraft with shocking efficiency. But the journey to that revelation had begun 3 years earlier in a dusty Nevada desert, with men who had no idea they were about to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. January 25, 1941, Las Vegas, Nevada. The temperature hovered near freezing as Colonel Martinez Stenith stepped out of his staff car and surveyed 60 square miles of absolutely nothing. Creosote bushes, jackrabbits, and endless sand stretched in every direction under a pale winter sky. This desolate wasteland, he had been told, would become the most important gunnery school in American military history. The problem facing the United States Army Air Forces was simple but terrifying. They had exactly 0 specialized facilities for training aerial gunners, not one school dedicated to teaching men how to shoot from moving aircraft at moving targets, not one standardized curriculum, not one proven method for turning farm boys and factory workers into men who could defend flying fortresses and their crews from enemy fighters traveling 300 miles per hour. The stakes were equally simple. Without trained gunners, the entire American strategic bombing campaign would fail before it began. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns for defense. But those guns were worthless if the men behind them did not know how to use them, and as of January 1941, they did not. The British had learned this lesson the hard way. Royal Air Force bomber crews flying night missions over Germany were being slaughtered by Luftwaffe fighters. British gunners, trained primarily on ground targets and static exercises, were utterly unprepared for 3-dimensional aerial combat. They aimed directly at attacking fighters, exactly as their instincts demanded. They missed, and they died. The United States military was determined not to repeat that catastrophe. On January 25, 1941, the Army Air Forces leased 60,000 acres of Nevada desert from the city of Las Vegas for $1 per year. Construction crews arrived in March. Barracks, classrooms, hangars, and firing ranges appeared where nothing had stood before. By June 17th, 103 instructors had reported for duty, men who would have to figure out how to teach a skill that nobody in America truly understood. The formal order came swiftly. On December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, the Chief of the Air Forces ordered immediate aerial gunnery training for gunners. The base was officially activated on December 20th. Within weeks, the first students began arriving at Las Vegas Army Airfield. The war had begun, and America desperately needed trained aerial gunners. The training began on solid ground. Instructors mounted shotguns on fixed platforms with limited arcs of fire, then had students shoot at clay pigeons hurled into the air at various angles. The idea was sound. Skeet shooting taught the fundamentals of leading a moving target, of aiming ahead to intercept something traveling perpendicular to your line of sight. Most students hit their targets. They were learning deflection shooting, the age-old technique hunters had used for centuries. If a duck is flying left to right, you aim ahead of it. Your pellets and the duck arrive at the same point simultaneously. Simple physics, intuitive, natural. Then the instructors mounted the shotguns on the backs of moving trucks. Suddenly, everything changed. As the trucks rumbled through the desert, students found their targets becoming impossible to hit. Clay pigeons that should have been easy shots sailed past, untouched. Confusion spread through the ranks. These men were shooting exactly as they had been taught, leading their targets, aiming ahead. Why were they missing? The answer lay in a principle so counterintuitive that even experienced instructors struggled to explain it. When you are standing still and shooting at a moving target, you aim ahead. But when you are moving and shooting at a moving target, the rules flip upside down. Sergeant Robert Hayes, an instructor from Texas with a background in physics, stood before his first class of bewildered trainees and drew a simple diagram on a blackboard. A bomber traveling 300 miles per hour, a fighter attacking from the side at the same speed, a bullet fired from a gun on that bomber. The students assumed the bullet traveled straight from the gun to wherever they aimed. They were wrong. The bullet inherited the bomber's forward velocity the instant it left the barrel. Every round fired from a bomber was already traveling 300 miles per hour forward in addition to whatever velocity the gun provided. This meant a bullet fired to the side did not actually travel to the side. It traveled diagonally, pushed forward by the bomber's momentum, even as it moved away from the gun. The faster the bomber flew, the more pronounced this effect became. At 300 miles per hour, a bullet fired 90 degrees to the side would curve forward dramatically, like a curveball in baseball, but far more extreme. Hayes pulled out a piece of string and a weight, creating a simple pendulum. He walked forward while letting the weight swing. The students watched as the weight did not hang straight down. It angled backward, pulled by the forward motion. "Release that weight," Hayes explained, "and it doesn't drop straight down. It carries forward with you. Your bullets work the same way." The implications were staggering. If a German fighter was attacking from directly abeam, 90 degrees to the bomber's side, and a gunner aimed directly at that fighter, the bullet would curve forward and pass harmlessly ahead of the target. The bomber's own speed guaranteed a miss. To hit a target directly to the side, you had to aim behind it, sometimes way behind it. The exact amount depended on the angle of attack, the speeds of both aircraft, and the distance to the target. But the principle remained constant and completely violated human instinct. The British had discovered this principle through brutal trial and error over the skies of Europe. They called it the zone system, dividing the defensive sphere around a bomber into zones, each requiring different aiming techniques. The Americans adopted and refined this approach, eventually developing what they called position firing. Position firing was based on a critical observation about how fighters attacked bombers. To bring their fixed forward-firing guns to bear, fighters had to fly pursuit curves, continuous arcing paths that kept their guns pointed at the bomber. From the gunner's perspective, an attacking fighter appeared to slide sideways toward the bomber's tail, while simultaneously growing larger as it closed the distance. This created a geometric relationship that could be calculated. The fighter's angle to the bomber's fore and aft axis, combined with the bomber's speed and the bullet's velocity, determined exactly where the gunner needed to aim. The Army Air Forces developed tables, charts, and eventually a simple rule system based on the concept of radians of deflection. A radian in this context was an angular measurement that told gunners how far behind the attacking fighter to aim. At a 90-degree attack angle with both aircraft at typical speeds, a gunner might need to aim 8 to 12 radians behind the fighter. Each radian represented a specific angular distance, roughly equivalent to one aircraft length at combat ranges. This meant aiming 8 to 12 aircraft lengths behind an attacking fighter to score a hit. Everything in the gunner's training, every instinct from hunting and target shooting, screamed that this was insane. But mathematics and physics did not care about instincts. By summer 1942, Las Vegas, Army Airfield was graduating 600 gunners every 5 weeks. The training had evolved into a comprehensive 6-week program that systematically broke down students' natural shooting instincts and rebuilt them with position firing principles. Week 1 covered ground school, ballistics, aircraft recognition, basic mechanical knowledge of the .50 caliber Browning machine gun. Students learned to field, strip, and reassemble their weapons blindfolded, preparing for the reality of working in cramped, freezing, vibrating gun positions. Week 2 moved to the shotgun trucks. Students spent hours shooting clay pigeons from moving platforms, ingraining the feel of shooting while in motion. Instructors gradually increased the truck speeds, forcing students to adjust their aim points further and further behind the targets. Week 3 introduced the manipulation trainers. These were towers 10 to 40 feet tall, arranged like a bomber formation. Students sat in mock turrets tracking dummy. Fighters pulled on wires through the sky. No live ammunition, just the constant practice of keeping a gun sight on a moving target while compensating for the bomber's motion. Week 4 brought the Waller gunnery trainer. Students sat in darkness, firing at fighter images projected on a large concave screen. As the images dove and weaved, students tracked and fired while the trainer recorded every trigger pull, every hit and miss. The trainer could simulate any attack angle, any speed, any situation. Students saw their mistakes immediately, learned from them, and tried again. Week 5 was air-to-air firing. Students climbed into actual B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, took positions at waist guns and turrets, and fired at fabric sleeves towed behind other aircraft. Each student's ammunition was color-coded. After each mission, instructors counted the holes, tallied the hits, and gave immediate feedback. Week 6 was advanced aerial firing and final examinations. Students faced simulated attacks from multiple angles, practiced emergency procedures, and demonstrated proficiency in all defensive positions. The washout rate was approximately 20%. Those who graduated received their silver gunner wings and assignments to bomber crews. By July 7, 1943, the 7 gunnery schools across the United States had graduated 19,789 gunners. By year's end, that number reached 57,176. Las Vegas alone was producing 600 graduates every 5 weeks at peak capacity. The production machine was running at full capacity, but production was not the same as effectiveness. The real test came over Europe. August 17, 1943. 27,000 feet above Germany. 376 B-17 bombers of the United States 8th Air Force droned toward Schweinfurt and Regensburg, deep inside the Third Reich. The mission was ambitious: destroy the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Regensburg, cripple Germany's ability to build fighters and keep existing ones flying. The Luftwaffe had other plans. Over 400 German fighters rose to meet the American formation. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighters equipped with rockets. The air war was about to become a slaughter. The German fighters employed new tactics, specifically designed to overwhelm bomber defensive fire. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, where the B-17 had minimal defensive armament. Attacks from 6 o'clock low, exploiting the ball turret's limited firing angles, and devastating rocket attacks from beyond effective machine gun range. What happened next shocked both sides. The American bombers lost 60 aircraft, 20% of the attacking force. catastrophic losses that convinced many that daylight strategic bombing without fighter escort was impossible. But the Germans also lost aircraft, not the handful they expected, not 10 or 20. The American gunners, using position firing techniques learned at Las Vegas and the other gunnery schools, shot down approximately 27 German fighters. This number was far lower than the initial claims of over 200 kills, claims made in the fog and chaos of combat where multiple gunners often fired at the same target. But even the verified kills represented something new. American bomber gunners, if properly trained, could hit and destroy attacking fighters. Waist gunners across the formation applied the techniques they had learned in Nevada, fighter attacking from 3 o'clock level, range approximately 300 yards, apply 12 radians deflection, aim between the fighter and the bomber's tail, open fire in 3-round bursts. Observe strikes on the fighter's wing root and engine. Fighter breaks off smoking, disappears in vertical dive. The technique worked precisely as the mathematics predicted. But the gunners also noted something critical. Initial instinct was always to aim directly at the target. They had to consciously force themselves to apply proper deflection. Training overcame instinct. Without the systematic instruction at gunnery schools, they would have missed. This was the key insight. Position firing was not natural. It violated every hunting instinct, every basic shooting principle that students brought with them. Only intensive, repetitive training could override those instincts in the stress of combat. Men who had spent 6 weeks shooting from moving platforms, tracking fighters on simulators, and firing at towed targets could force themselves to aim behind when every nerve in their bodies screamed to aim ahead. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid taught both sides valuable lessons. The Germans learned that massed bomber formations with properly trained gunners were far more dangerous than expected. Individual fighter attacks, even from advantageous angles, carried significant risk. The Americans learned that daylight bombing without fighter escort was unsustainable despite good gunnery training. But the raid also validated the training program. Position firing worked. Gunners who applied proper deflection could hit fast-moving fighters in 3-dimensional combat. The question now was how to make them even more effective. The answer came from an unexpected source: Britain. In late 1943, Royal Air Force night fighters began equipping with a revolutionary new device called the Mark II gyro gunsight. This technological marvel used a spinning gyroscope, mirrors, and a complex series of calculations to automatically compute the correct deflection for any attack angle. The pilot simply placed a moving reticle on the target, and the sight did the rest. The United States Army Air Forces immediately recognized the potential. If a gyroscopic sight could calculate deflection for fighter pilots, could a similar system work for bomber gunners? In November 1943, American engineers began adapting British gyro sight technology for bomber turret applications. The result was the K-14 gun sight for fighters and adapted versions for bomber turrets. These sights featured a revolutionary dual reticle system. One reticle, fixed, showed where the guns actually pointed. A second reticle, gyroscopically controlled, showed where the bullets would actually go, accounting for the aircraft's motion, the angle of fire, and basic ballistics. In level flight, with no deflection required, the two reticles aligned perfectly. But the moment a gunner swung his turret to track a target, the gyro reticle moved, showing exactly where to aim. The gunner simply had to keep the moving reticle on the target. The sight automatically calculated the proper lead. Installing gyro sights in bomber turrets presented significant challenges. The sights were bulky, complex, and required the gunner to input the target's wingspan to estimate range. Under combat conditions, with fighters attacking from multiple angles simultaneously, setting wingspan dials and adjusting controls was often impossible. Still, the gyro sights represented a massive improvement. Tests conducted in early 1944 showed that gunners using gyro sights achieved approximately double the hit rate compared to standard ring and bead sights, even when both groups understood position firing principles. The automated deflection calculation removed the mental burden of remembering radian charts and angular measurements. By summer 1944, significant numbers of American bombers carried compensating sights, automated systems that calculated deflection based on the turret's position and the bomber's airspeed and altitude. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These were not as sophisticated as full gyro sights, but they were simpler to operate under combat stress. Gunners set their airspeed and altitude once, then simply tracked the target. The sight adjusted the aiming point automatically. The effectiveness difference was dramatic. Bombers equipped with advanced sighting systems and gunners trained in position firing could bring down attacking fighters at ranges and angles previously considered impossible. Combat reports documented significant improvements. Gunners who had struggled to score hits with standard sights found themselves downing enemy aircraft within weeks of receiving compensating sights. By late 1944, the Army Air Forces had refined the gunnery training program based on 2 years of combat experience. The 6-week course expanded to include more advanced topics: gunnery control and discipline, ensuring gunners did not fire at friendly fighters; combat tactics, understanding German fighter attack patterns; emergency procedures for jammed guns, damaged turrets, and wounded crew members. One innovation particularly captured the imagination of both instructors and students: Operation Pinball. Las Vegas Army Airfield received 7 specially modified Bell RP-63 King Cobra fighters. These aircraft, called pinballs, wore thick duralumin armor plating over their entire exterior. Students fired special frangible bullets, ammunition made from compressed powdered lead and plastic that shattered into dust on impact with any hard surface. The pinball aircraft carried electronic sensors and a large red light in the propeller spinner. When a frangible bullet struck the aircraft, the light flashed. Students could immediately see their hits. More importantly, the pinball pilots flew realistic attack patterns, diving and weaving exactly as German and Japanese fighters did. Students learned to track real aircraft pulling real maneuvers, not fabric sleeves on predictable tow courses. The pinball program produced dramatic improvements in gunnery scores. Students who trained against pinballs showed 30 to 40% better hit rates in subsequent combat compared to students trained only on towed targets. The program expanded to all 7 Army Air Forces gunnery schools by early 1945. But the most revealing data came from analyzing combat results. As more bombers received advanced sights and more gunners completed improved training, the effectiveness of defensive fire increased measurably. Intelligence officers tracking German fighter losses attributed to bomber gunners documented a clear upward trend from mid-1943 through war's end. The statistics were complicated by the introduction of long-range fighter escorts, which dramatically reduced bomber losses and changed the nature of aerial combat over Europe. By early 1944, American P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German fighters that had previously attacked bomber formations at will now faced aggressive American and British fighters hunting them throughout their own territory. Still, the data was clear. Bombers with trained gunners and proper sighting equipment shot down approximately twice as many attacking fighters as bombers with untrained crews and basic sights. This twofold improvement came from a combination of factors: better training in position firing principles, more sophisticated sighting equipment, improved tactics and fire discipline. But at the core was the counterintuitive truth learned in the Nevada desert, the technique that seemed to violate every law of common sense. When you are standing still, aim ahead of a moving target. When you are moving, aim behind. Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth understood this truth better than most. The tail gunner aboard Tondelayo flew his first mission in June 1943. By September, he had become one of the most effective gunners in the 8th Air Force. On September 12, 1943, during the Schweinfurt raid, Arooth shot down 7 German fighters in a single mission. His success was not luck. It was the direct result of understanding and applying position-firing principles under the most extreme stress imaginable. In his post-mission debriefing, Arooth described his technique with remarkable clarity. When they come in from the beam, you can see them real clear. Every instinct says put the sight right on them. But I learned to count aircraft lengths. At 300 yards, I aim about 8 plane lengths behind. At closer range, maybe 5 or 6. The bullets curve forward and meet them. The hardest part, he continued, is trusting it when they are shooting back. When you see those muzzle flashes and you know they are trying to kill you, your brain wants to aim right at them. You have to force yourself to aim at empty sky. It feels wrong every single time. But Arooth's discipline paid off. By the time he completed his tour of 14 missions, he had shot down 17 confirmed German fighters, making him one of the highest-scoring aerial gunners in Air Force history. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on September 12th. His success represented the culmination of everything the gunnery schools had worked to achieve. A young man from a farm in the Midwest, with no special skills or advantages, transformed through systematic training into a precision marksman capable of defending his aircraft and crew against determined enemy attacks. The transformation was not unique to Arooth. Across the 8th Air Force, gunners were achieving results that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Sergeant Benjamin Warner, a waist gunner on a B-17, shot down 7 German fighters during a mission on July 5, 1943. John Quinlan, tail gunner aboard the famous Memphis Belle, finished his tour with 8 confirmed kills. These men were not superhuman. They were simply well trained in a technique that worked. The statistics tell the story. In early 1943, bomber gunners achieved hit rates, below 4% against crossing targets. By late 1944, that rate had climbed to over 20% for gunners with advanced training and proper equipment. That 5-fold improvement represented thousands of American airmen who flew home instead of dying over Germany. It represented German fighters that went down in flames instead of escaping to fight another day. It represented bombing campaigns that reached their targets instead of being turned back by fighter attacks. The Pacific Theater provided another testing ground for American gunnery techniques. Japanese fighter tactics differed significantly from German approaches. Zero fighters and Oscars relied on superior maneuverability rather than armor and firepower. They attacked from steeper angles, executed tighter turns, and often pressed attacks to point-blank range, relying on their agility to avoid defensive fire. American gunners adapted position firing principles to these new challenges. The B-29 Superfortress, deployed in the Pacific from late 1944 onward, featured a revolutionary remote control gun system. Gunners sat in pressurized compartments, controlling turrets via periscope sights and electronic fire control systems. The system automatically calculated deflection based on target range, angle, and aircraft speeds. Central Fire Control gunners on B-29 seconds described the system's effectiveness in post-war interviews. Japanese fighters would come in fast, usually from below, trying to get under the formation. Gunners would acquire the target in their sights. The computer would calculate range and deflection. And they would fire. The turrets would swing automatically. Barrels would elevate or depress. All the gunner had to do was keep the sight on target and squeeze. The speeds were too high, the angles too difficult for manual calculation. The automated system made defensive gunnery possible against Japan's fastest fighters. The B-29's Central Fire Control system represented the ultimate evolution of position firing technology. Human gunners provided target acquisition and tracking. Computers handled all ballistics calculations, including deflection, bullet drop, and even wind drift. The combination proved devastatingly effective. When the war ended in August 1945, the Army Air Forces had graduated over 214,000 aerial gunners from 7 specialized gunnery schools. Las Vegas alone had trained over 44,000 gunners through August 1944. These men had learned to override their instincts, to trust mathematics and physics over common sense, to let their bombers' speed carry bullets into enemy aircraft. The statistical impact was difficult to quantify precisely. Combat claims were notoriously inflated. Multiple gunners often fired at the same fighter, each claiming the kill. Gun camera footage was limited, especially in bombers where cameras could not cover all defensive positions. German and Japanese loss records were incomplete, destroyed in bombing raids or lost in the chaos of surrender. But analysis of available data suggested that properly trained American bomber gunners achieved legitimate kill rates approximately double those of untrained gunners using the same equipment. This improvement came almost entirely from understanding and applying position firing principles. The technique did not make gunners superhuman, it made them competent, and in aerial combat, competence meant survival. The lessons learned in World War II gunnery schools influenced military aviation for decades afterward. Korean War B-29 gunners used refined versions of the same position, firing techniques in aerial combat against advanced Soviet MiG-15 fighters. The principles remained valid even against jet aircraft with significant performance advantages over the propeller-driven bombers. Modern fighter aircraft still employ the same basic principle. Advanced computing gun sights calculate deflection automatically, but the underlying physics remains identical. A projectile fired from a moving aircraft inherits that aircraft's velocity. To hit a target, you must account for your own motion, not just the target's motion. The Nevada desert that once hosted the Las Vegas Army Airfield is now Nellis Air Force Base, home of the Air Force Fighter Weapons School and the Thunderbirds demonstration team. The old gunnery ranges are gone, replaced by modern training facilities. But the fundamental truth discovered there in January 1941 remains engraved in American military doctrine. When you are standing still, aim ahead of a moving target. When you are moving, aim behind. Physics does not care what feels natural, it only cares what works. The German Luftwaffe never fully adopted position firing principles for their bomber gunners. German training emphasized individual marksmanship and relied heavily on experience. New gunners learned from veterans, absorbing techniques through informal mentorship rather than systematic instruction. This approach worked well enough when the Luftwaffe operated primarily over friendly territory with experienced crews. But as losses mounted and veteran gunners died, German bomber defensive effectiveness declined sharply. The Japanese military faced similar challenges. Training for aerial gunners remained limited and informal. Position firing concepts were understood by some individuals but never systematized into doctrine. Japanese bombers suffered accordingly, with defensive gunnery effectiveness far below American standards. The British initially developed many of the concepts that became American position firing doctrine, but British bomber tactics evolved differently than American approaches. Royal Air Force Bomber Command shifted to night operations where visual gunnery played a reduced role compared to electronic countermeasures and fighter escorts. The RAF did deploy gyro gun sights in some aircraft, including the experimental Village Inn radar-aimed tail turret for Lancaster bombers, but never implemented the comprehensive training programs that characterized American gunnery schools. Only the United States combined systematic position, firing training with advanced sighting technology and industrial-scale production of trained personnel. This combination created bomber crews who could defend themselves effectively even without fighter escort, though escort remained vastly preferable. The transformation from instinctive aiming to calculated position firing represented a profound shift in human skill development. For thousands of years, hunters and soldiers had learned to aim directly at their targets or slightly ahead for moving targets. These techniques were intuitive, easily taught, and effective in most situations. Aerial combat in fast-moving bombers broke all the old rules. Speeds were too high, angles too complex, and the physics too counterintuitive. Success required abandoning instinct and embracing abstract mathematics. Trainees had to trust that aiming 12 aircraft lengths behind an attacking fighter would result in a hit, even when everything they had ever known about shooting said otherwise. This mental transformation was perhaps the greatest achievement of the Army Air Force's gunnery schools, not the facilities built in the Nevada desert, not the sophisticated training equipment, but the ability to rewire human instincts, to override millions of years of hunter-gatherer programming with calculated precision. The legacy of World War II aerial gunnery training extends far beyond the war itself. The systematic approach to breaking down complex skills, the emphasis on repetitive training to override instinct, and the integration of technology with human performance became models for military training worldwide. Modern fighter pilots learn position firing concepts in their first weeks of training. The terminology has changed. The equipment is vastly more sophisticated, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. A projectile fired from a moving platform inherits that platform's velocity. Proper aiming requires compensating for your own motion, not just the target's motion. By 1945, the United States had developed the most effective aerial gunnery training program in history. The combination of systematic position, firing instruction, advanced sighting equipment, and intensive hands-on practice produced gunners who could defend bombers against determined fighter attacks. The improvement in effectiveness came from understanding one counterintuitive truth. When attacking fighters appear at 3 o'clock, screaming in at 300 miles per hour, trained gunners do not aim where the fighters are. They do not aim where they are going. They aim where they have been. They aim behind, trusting that their bomber's speed will carry bullets forward into the fighter's path. They override every instinct, every natural response, and they do what the mathematics demands. The gunnery schools closed in September 1945. As the war ended and demobilization began, the facilities at Las Vegas transitioned to other uses, eventually becoming Nellis Air Force Base. The instructors returned to civilian life, carrying with them the knowledge of how to teach an impossible skill. The students dispersed across America, forever changed by their experience. But the lesson remained, carved into military doctrine and preserved in training manuals that would influence aerial combat for generations. The lesson that sometimes survival demands doing what feels completely wrong. That mathematical precision can overcome natural instinct. That proper training can rewire the human brain to perform calculations faster than conscious thought. American bomber gunners learned to account for their motion. They learned to aim behind. And in learning that one counterintuitive principle, they helped win the most destructive war in human history. The story of position firing is ultimately a story about human adaptability, about the capacity to learn skills that violate instinct, about the power of systematic training to transform ordinary people into specialists capable of extraordinary performance under impossible conditions. It is a story about physics and mathematics, but it is also a story about trust. Trust in instructors who taught techniques that felt wrong, trust in equipment that calculated what human brains struggled to compute, trust in training that overrode millions of years of evolution. That trust was earned in the skies over Europe and the Pacific, where properly trained gunners brought down enemy fighters that would have otherwise killed their crews. Where understanding deflection meant survival. The Nevada desert that birthed this transformation is now home to the most advanced combat aviation training in the world. The Thunderbirds perform aerial demonstrations that would have seemed impossible to the men who trained there in 1942. The Fighter Weapons School teaches tactics and techniques that would have been science fiction during World War II. But the fundamental principle remains: motion affects trajectory, speed changes everything, and sometimes hitting your target requires aiming at where it is not. Trusting mathematics to bring bullet and target together in the future. American aerial gunners learned that lesson the hard way, through intensive training in the Nevada desert and brutal validation over the skies of Europe and the Pacific. They learned to override their instincts, to trust the training. And in learning that one counterintuitive truth, they became the most effective bomber defensive gunners of World War II, not through superior weapons, not through better aircraft, but through understanding physics and having the discipline to apply that understanding, even when instinct screamed otherwise. Physics does not care what feels natural, it only cares what works. And in the skies above World War II battlefields, what worked was position firing, a counterintuitive truth that saved thousands of lives and helped win a war. When Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth climbed out of the tail turret of Tondelayo on September 12th, 1943, his hands were still shaking. Not from fear, though fear had been present during every second of combat, but from the simple physical toll of firing thousands of rounds through vibrating machine guns at 27,000 feet in -60-degree temperatures. 7 confirmed kills. 7 German fighters that would never attack another American bomber. 7 enemy pilots who would not return to base. His squadron mates gathered around, slapping him on the back, asking how he had done it. How had he scored so many hits when others had fired just as many rounds with far fewer results? Arooth's answer was simple. I aimed where they were not, where they had been. And I trusted the math. That simple statement encapsulated everything the Army Air Forces had worked to achieve. The systematic training, the counterintuitive technique, the triumph of calculated precision over natural instinct. In the years after the war, Arooth rarely spoke about his combat experiences. When pressed, he would say only that he had been well trained and fortunate. But those who knew the technical details understood the truth. Michael Arooth had not been lucky. He had been competent, and that competence, replicated across thousands of bomber gunners, had made the difference between catastrophic failure and hard-won victory in the skies over Nazi Germany. The revolution in aerial gunnery that began with confused students on shotgun trucks in the Nevada desert and culminated with precision marksmen defending bomber formations over Europe represented one of the most dramatic tactical improvements of World War II. It proved something essential about human capability. We are not prisoners of our instincts. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough motivation, we can rewire our responses to match reality rather than demanding reality match our intuitions. That lesson, born in blood over Europe and the Pacific, remains relevant anywhere humans confront situations where instinct and solution point in opposite directions. American aerial gunners learned to aim at empty sky, to fire at nothing visible, to trust their bullets would meet metal somewhere in the future. And in learning that impossible skill, they proved that even the most counterintuitive truth can be mastered when survival demands it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.